What do you think is the most compelling pro-choice argument?
Honestly, I think when you go through a pro-life response, there truly isn't any pro-abortion argument I have found that compelling.
Stephanie Gray Connors, welcome to Exclusives.
I'm honored to be a part of your program.
Full disclosure, we go way back, and I haven't gotten to do this with you yet, so I'm very excited for our conversation.
I know, because all of our life has been all the personal, and now we get to do all the professional.
Yes.
So
we're going to do the ultimate apologetics showdown.
Okay.
Nobody better to do it than Stephanie Gray Connors. You've done, I mean, I met you, I think, as an activist at 18 years old. So
yeah, you were around 19, and I was 27. And I've been working full-time for 5 years.
In the pro-life movement, yes. Mm-hmm. And your resume is just amazing, what you've accomplished. Can you just share for folks your background in the movement, the pro-life movement, and your expertise?
Yeah, so my contribution to the movement really is teaching people to argue well and to not just win an argument, but to win a person. So how do we communicate truth persuasively and compassionately? And my specialty is pro-life apologetics, which I always like to tell people is not apologizing for being pro-life, but providing a defense of, an apologia, a defense of our perspective on why we ought to reject abortion and other evils which attack the, vulnerable human person. And so I have spent 20 years plus traveling the world, speaking and debating on the topic primarily of abortion, but other topics related as well, and often formally debating abortion advocates in often university and college settings, conferences, all kinds of avenues, and it's been quite the ride.
You are my guru, because before some of my biggest debates that I've done, I've called you.
You have, yes.
And actually, before one of my biggest debates, I flew to Vancouver to do a deep dive day of just apologetics with you to practice.
Yes.
And you've given me some of my framework that has been successful in debating because you blaze the trail. So thank you.
Well, you're welcome. And I was asked actually the other day from someone who's like, how do we get to your level of being able to know how to respond to people? And I say always three things: prayer, study, and practice. So I call on the Lord for inspiration. I study, and I've been given great wisdom over the years from different mentors who've been an example to me. They've also told me, read this, watch that. And then I practice. And there's nothing like trying an argument in front of someone and then watching it fail and telling yourself, okay, I'm not going to do that again. But then trying something that you might not even be intentionally trying, hence it's the fruit of the spirit of prayer. You just say something and you watch it absolutely transform their thinking. And you can see a light bulb go off as you look in their eyes. And then I make a mental note, well, I will use that argument again. And then when I do training seminars, I will teach people to use that argument. So, yeah.
The pro-life movement will be successful if we have changed enough hearts and minds.
Yeah.
Because we need the laws, but the laws, especially in our democratic republic, we can't achieve the legal protections we need for the preborn that they deserve if people are blind to their value. So half of our battle in the movement is changing hearts and minds. That's Life Action's first mission.
Right.
Cultural change and renewal, change hearts and minds. So your approach, which is not just make the logical case and make it compelling, but be winsome in how you present, gracious, kind, inviting, asking questions, understanding where the person's coming from. That combination, I think, is essential for us to actually win the culture.
Right.
And so thank you for trailblazing on it and inspiring me and so many at Life Action. And today I thought we would just go through some of the biggest pro-choice arguments, Stephanie Gray style responses to them, kind of like a primer that we can do together.
Sure.
We're going to touch on IVF as well, because I know you just wrote a phenomenal book on IVF. You guys should check that out. Where can people find your book on IVF, by the way?
Yeah, so my publisher Word on Fire sells it through their bookstore. If you go to my website, loveunleasheslife.com, I've got all my books there and links to each one and where you can best get them.
Amazing. Okay, so before we go through kind of some of the most difficult pro-abortion arguments, I want to start by asking you, if you have 60 seconds to make the pro-life case, what would you say?
I would start with a question and say to the individual or my audience, do you believe in human rights? If so, and I think we all do, then who ought to get human rights? And if we believe children get children's rights and women get women's rights, then it would follow that humans are who get human rights. So then we simply need to ask, what does science say for when human beings begin their lives? And because we're beings which reproduce sexually, science has established that it's a sperm-egg fusion or fertilization when beings which reproduce sexually begin their lives. And humans are an example of that, which means human beings begin their lives at fertilization. At fertilization, the one-celled embryo is immediately growing. 1 cell, 2 cell, 4 cell, 8, and so forth. By the embryo's growth, we know the embryo's living. By the mom and the dad being human, we know the embryo's human. And since we believe in human rights, then that tiny youngest member of the human family ought to have the same right to life that you or I have.
Love it.
Was that 60 seconds?
I think it was faster. I didn't time you. I should have been timing, but that was beautiful. Okay, so then a common response that I'm noticing happening right now, because kind of, I think different pro-choice arguments ebb and flow in terms of what's most popular, and, you know, depending on what's going on the internet that month or that year. But the common response I hear to what you just said, which is beautifully stated, is, okay, well, sure, they're human, but they're not persons yet.
Right.
They're not persons. And you have to counterbalance to the little embryo, tiny 1 cell embryo, the mother's rights and her right to her autonomy and her right to her health and her right to whatever other rights she might possess that they could maybe invent or state. And so what about the personhood argument? They do become a person at a certain point because of consciousness. That generally defines humanity for people, because humans are different than animals because of their degree of consciousness and their ability to have certain experiences and abilities that maybe other animals in the animal kingdom don't have. Anyways, that typically maybe starts to fire around 20-ish weeks. What would you say?
Right. So I debated several years ago.
I'm playing the pro-choice person here.
You don't really think that. So a few years ago, I debated Peter Singer, a Princeton philosophy professor, and he's well known for acknowledging the embryo of human parents is a human being, but denying that they're persons. And so when I encounter people like him or others, I always ask a question. How do you define person? What is a person? And as you pointed out, often abortion supporters will say, well, a person is someone who's conscious or rational. They are self-aware. They can feel pain, they'll even say. So then I like to ask, okay, well, why can't a one-celled human embryo in that moment be conscious, rational, self-aware, or feel pain? And the answer is, well, what the embryo lacks in that moment is what's needed for those functions, which is a brain. They don't have a brain. So then I would say to the abortion supporter, why don't they have a brain? And then they might look at me a little funny because the answer to them is obvious, but I have them say it so they own the answer and we can probe deeper. And so then they'll say, well, they haven't had time to develop the brain. And the moment I get them to the point of talking about time is when I then say, okay, and time is reflected in our age. And my point there is to get them to realize that all the criteria they're focusing on for why a human embryo in their mind is not a person is ultimately tied into how old the embryo is. It is because of the embryo's age that they are younger, that they are less developed and have not had the time to develop the structures necessary to manifest the qualities that indeed our species has, that they aren't able to do these things yet. So then I ask the question, should our personhood, which is really a legal term we use to define whether something gets protected under the law or not, should our personhood be grounded in or defined by how old we are or what we are? And then I actually like to point out to abortion supporters, if you go to an authority that they would typically go to, the United Nations, which is often perceived as a very pro-abortion organization, and I will say to them, if you go to the original, more foundational doctrines of something like the United Nations, you will actually see there are some inherently pro-life beliefs within them. And if you look, for example, at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it says, everyone, in Article 6, everyone has a right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. So 2 points we make in response to that. One, who's everyone? Let's define our terms. So that's Article 6. Go to the preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The preamble talks about all members of the human family. Well, if this document is in reference to all members of the human family, then we can basically take the term everyone and replace it with all members of the human family have a right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. So the point is, it should be your human nature that is what gives you the legal protection of person, not your developmental level, because that's going to change from one human to the next. Even a newborn baby isn't conscious and rational to the level that you and I are right now, communicating with one another and thinking and comprehending and so forth. The next point I would make when the issue of personhood comes up is to ask, when was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted? When did it come along? Well, it came along in the late 1940s. So then I asked the question, what was going on in the early 1940s? Well, World War II, when the Holocaust occurred. So why did this document come to be? What happened during the Holocaust? You have some humans who were denied what? Personhood status. Based on what? Some arbitrary quality, your religion or your ethnicity. So then we'll say to someone, and what about even before that, when slavery occurred in the United States? Black individuals were considered humans, but what? Not persons. Or even we women at a time here in America and other countries, my original home country of Canada, women were once denied personhood, even though they were considered humans, based on what? Our sex. So we see this document coming into being in the late 1940s saying, all members of the human family ought to be considered persons, because what it was trying to respond to was this ugly, terrible human history where we have a pattern of saying some humans aren't persons based on sex, skin color, ethnicity, or religion. So I would simply add, it's just as discriminatory and arbitrary to deny humans personhood status based on age. And all the criteria used to deny preborn human embryos or fetuses personhood status ultimately boils down to how old they are.
So I think it's very beautifully stated and compelling. I'm to put on the best attempt at devil's advocate,
please,
in response. So to kind of take the one more step with the personhood argument, for the opposition to respond to you and say, okay, all of what you're saying, is interesting, but the reality is that consciousness experience, like you said, the brain hasn't developed yet, right? You could also say, well, the single cell embryo hasn't developed yet because sperm egg fusion hasn't happened, but sperm egg fusion ultimately will happen at some point. But obviously we don't assign any kind of special value to a single egg cell or to a single sperm cell, right? So this idea of continuum, that, there's a continuum. And so you're saying, well, let's protect the human at any time in the continuum, even if they don't possess these very important human qualities.
Yes.
You could argue, well, let's go further back. Why not go further back? And create
it.
Special assignments for sperm or egg cells.
Yes, so glad you said that. So then I would say, awesome point. I would actually almost make a little concession, say, love how you're thinking.
Thank you.
So let's unpack what you've just said. And then I would say, when we're talking about...
Get your pro-choice opponent to feel...
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Won something a little bit, but then I'm going to take it down. So you're correct that what I talked about is something living, because then it's living, or its parent's human, then it's human, we ought to protect it. So you could maybe argue, well, the egg and the sperm are alive, and the egg and the sperm of human people are therefore human egg and sperm. Do we protect these living human things? So then I would say the important distinction here is what is a part versus what is a whole. So a sperm and an egg by themselves are human parts, equivalent to my arm or my leg or a skin cell. And if you take a sperm by itself and put it in my uterus, it's not going to grow and mature through the stages of human development. Even an egg in my body by itself without any sperm to fertilize it is not going to grow and develop through the stages of human development. Even a skin cell, we could kind of get into cloning a bit, but without doing the intricacies of cloning, any manipulations, and just taking a skin cell, which would have 46 chromosomes, as opposed to the sperm and the egg by themselves, which have 23. You take a skin cell and you put it in my uterus. It is not by itself going to grow and develop through the stages of human development, but take a one-celled human embryo and it will. So the difference is parts versus wholes. You don't have to do anything to the embryo once fertilization has occurred. Now, does the embryo need to be in the right environment with the right nourishment to be able to continue along a trajectory to maturity? Yes, but the same is true for you and me. We're never going to get to age 50 if we're in the wrong environment without proper nourishment. So I would say that we don't protect sperm and egg like embryos, because those are parts versus a whole. And so that is a very, very important distinction, because all of us can trace back who we are today, looking at our baby pictures or just even thinking about our physiological development. We can all trace ourselves back to having been an infant, having been a 8-month fetus in our mom's womb, having been a 6-month fetus, having been a 5-week embryo, having been an embryo at fertilization, none of us can say that sperm was once me. Because if the sperm that contributed to my identity fertilized a different egg, you wouldn't be talking to me. If the egg, which contributed to who I am today, a different egg was used, you wouldn't be talking to me. So I can't claim my origins to a sperm by itself or a egg by itself, but I can claim who I am today as physiologically being the same as that one-celled embryo.
What do you think is the most compelling pro-choice argument?
Honestly, I think when you go through a pro-life response, there truly isn't any pro-abortion argument I have found that compelling. Having said that, before knowing a really solid pro-life response, where I stumbled a bit was when I was in college. So I was like, I think 19 years old, and I took a bioethics class, and we were presented the Judith Jarvis Thompson Violinist Argument. It was actually in my textbook. And this is a woman who presented a justification for abortion back in the 1970s. I was learning about it in 1999, and it's still one of the arguments that people talk about today when debating abortion. So in brief, this woman says, imagine that you wake up one day and you are in a hospital and you don't know what happened, and you turn over in the hospital bed and you discover you're in bed with a stranger and you're plugged into the stranger. Now imagine someone comes into the room and says, I'm terribly sorry for the situation you find yourself in, but the person that you're in bed with is a world famous violinist who was dearly beloved and was going to die. And the Society for Music Lovers found out that you were the only person in the entire world with the right body type to keep this violinist alive. So they kidnapped you last night, and they brought you here and plugged you into him so that we could keep this violinist alive. Now, don't worry, you won't be plugged into him forever, just for 9 months. So she presents this kind of thought experiment and says, just as you would have every right to reach around and unplug the violinist, who's a human person, admitting that, but arguing they don't have a right to use your body without your consent, so too ought a woman have a right to unplug her fetus, even if the fetus is a human person. So I remember when I first heard that argument thinking, I don't know how to respond. And then I was, obviously learned the apologetic. And then over the years, I've heard variants of that where people will say, well, the embryo might be a human person, but doesn't have a right to use my blood or my bone marrow or my kidney the way a born kid wouldn't have a right to my blood, my bone marrow, or my kidney. The embryo doesn't have a right to my uterus. And so the response is to say, well, first of all, you could do a heroic act and keep the violinist plugged into you. And if you say that, then you would have to keep the baby plugged into you. However, I think we can make the argument that the violinist doesn't have a right to use your body, and yet nonetheless abortion is still wrong, and the embryo does have a right to use the mother's body because of a key difference. One of the key differences, again, comes back to a question. What is the nature and purpose of the uterus? And the nature and purpose of the uterus is that it is an organ in my body, different from all my other body parts, in that it exists more for my offspring than it does for me. Just looking at the function of it, every single month, my uterus is thickening. Its endometrium, its lining is thickening in great expectation of what? Someone else's body. And if I get a period, that means no one else's body came along. So the very nature of this organ within me is it is existing and functioning for the purpose of sustaining the life of someone who's not me. And so therefore, you can say that the offspring of you have a right to your uterus in the way a stranger doesn't have a right to being plugged into your body or to have bone marrow or kidney or blood and so forth. So I think that's one point we need to make. The next point we need to make is what is the relationship between you and the child in the womb versus you and the stranger? We, of course, have to be kind to strangers and help strangers, but we don't have to go above and beyond the call of duty. And if someone is dying, their body's essentially breaking down like the violinist. I don't have a responsibility to take my healthy body in its totality and start breaking it down to keep someone alive when what's happening is their life is coming to its end. Whereas in the case of the child in my womb, the child isn't dying, the child is living. That's the only environment the child should be in. Like with the violinist, we're like, whoa, how did you get here? What happened? Whereas we might say, how did you get here with the baby in the womb? But we shouldn't really say that, because it's obvious that's the only place in the entire world for the baby to be in. And then we say, and who is that baby to me? That baby is my baby. That baby, if the first pregnancy I've had, has changed my very nature from merely being woman to now being mother. So then we have to ask ourselves, what do civil societies expect of mothers and fathers? And what we expect of them is that they care for their children, not harm their children, and they meet their child's basic needs. Even abortion supporters admit this, because when you hear these terrible news headlines we're hearing about, influencer actually hiding and torturing her children unknown to the public, or parent kills their child, parent chains their child to a bed, like all these horrible headlines, there's universal outrage, regardless of where you lie in the abortion debate, because there's this sense that we know intuitively parents have a responsibility to feed, clothe, shelter, and love their children. That's part of their basic needs. And so maintaining a pregnancy is meeting the basic needs of your child at that stage in their development. It's the food, clothing, shelter, and love that a child needs. It's not above and beyond the call of duty. An analogy I would make to someone is, if you're a parent who has a 2-year-old who's asking for dinner and you don't feed him, and then they ask for breakfast and you don't feed him, and day out, you're not feeding every time they request food. If you're caught, this will be child neglect, because your child is a dependent and relies on you to meet their needs. But if your child is a college student coming home for the weekend and they demand food and you refuse to feed them every meal and you lock up your fridge and don't let them access food, it might be weird, but you're not going to be charged with parental neglect, because your child who's a college student is capable of taking care of themselves. But your child who's 2 is a dependent. That actually heightens parental responsibility. So in the same way, the child in the womb is a dependent in the only place they should be in the place designed for them, and therefore the parent may not unplug that child the way they could reasonably, you could say, turn around and unplug the violinist, who would ultimately die from their underlying condition that was causing them to be dying.
I love it. The response that I've heard to that,
yes,
which again, I don't think these are compelling responses, but I'm trying to do my best foot forward to help, folks listening know how to anticipate responses, is, okay, well, sure, yes, parents have responsibilities to their children, but pregnancy is a uniquely difficult responsibility because it involves your body. You can't detach. You can detach 2-year-old, you can drop 2-year-old off at a safe haven, you could, adopt 2-year-old off, you could basically exit responsibilities from 2-year-old if you arrange that properly. With an unborn baby, you can't. You don't have that ability.
Right. But
also pregnancy can be life-threatening. And also women alone can get pregnant, not men. And so there's already an inequality built into the parenting structure for pregnancy. So because of these additional difficulties, the possibility of pregnancy to be life-threatening, the fact that the mother is only able to care in that situation, not the father. So there's no, off ramp. And then in the fact that you can't pass the baby off, and with a child you could. So if you choose to, the idea there is if you choose to maintain guardianship of your child, then of course you should feed them, but you have the option to pass them off. That would make it more, at least a different moral question to reject the child in the womb versus passing off the child or rejecting the child who's born.
Yes, so I'm glad you brought that up, because it allows us an opportunity to ask a very important question. I would say to the abortion supporter, you are right. There is a very unique relationship here that truly the woman cannot pass off her preborn child into the caring arms of someone else the way she could the born child. So instead of, starving, torturing, killing her born child, she says, okay, I'm going to put you in the arms of someone else who will meet your needs, and I won't hurt you, but I'm going to make sure you're safe. I can't do that to the preborn child. I have to keep the child in me. So here's the question we ask. Does that make the woman less responsible for the child in the womb, or does it actually make her more responsible for the child in the womb? So that's the question. And then I would propose an analogy. I would say, imagine you are trained in first aid and you know how to help people who are choking, and you're in a restaurant and you notice someone is choking at a nearby table. You know how to help them, but you also notice right beside their table is a bunch of paramedics on a lunch break, and several of the paramedics jump up and start to help the choking person. You do nothing. Have you done something wrong? I would ask the abortion supporter, by your inaction? And they would say, well, no, of course not. And correct, of course not, because the paramedics are helping the choking person. And then I would say, let's change the scenario a bit. Let's imagine you're trained in first aid, you know how to help choking people, and you're eating with a friend, but instead of being in a restaurant, you're in your own home, and it is just you and your friend. Now imagine your friend begins to choke. And imagine you do the same thing in this second scenario that you did in the first. Nothing. You just sit there. Of course, the person's going to keep choking and they die. Have you done something wrong now? And they will say, of course I have. So then I would ask, what is the difference between the first scenario and the second? In the first scenario, many people could help. It actually lessened your responsibility. In the second scenario, only you could help. That actually heightened your responsibility. So then I would extrapolate that point, bring it back to the original point of discussion and say, yes, the preborn child is totally dependent on the mom. Only she can keep the baby alive. She can't pass the baby off during this time of pregnancy, but that actually heightens her responsibility to meet the needs, again, not just of any vulnerable child, but particularly her vulnerable child, her offspring, the child who makes her a mother, and what do we expect of mothers? And then related to that, when people say, well, you know, pregnancy is tough on the body, it is. I mean, I've been pregnant and it's not been an easy go, but I know people who have way more difficult times being pregnant than even I did. There's physical realities post-pregnancy that can also be tough on the body that I've had to experience as well. But again, this is built into our nature. Our bodies were designed for offspring, even when that can be difficult. And so it comes back to, even with challenges, parenting born children can be difficult. You and I discussed this. It was a rough night for both of us with our kids, you know, being up multiple times, pretty much all the night in your case. It was exhausting. There are times I don't want to get up. There are times I don't want, you know, feel like I want to do the things that I need to do, but you do them even when something's hard, even when something's hurt, even when something is inconvenient. So when the woman's life is in danger, I always say to people, if that's only an ethical dilemma, if we admit the child is a human person with the right to the mother's womb, because then we're like, well, shoot, now we have two people. What do we do? If the child isn't a human person with a right to the mom's womb, there isn't even a discussion to be had. Just do whatever you want. But the acknowledgement that, okay, this is an ethical dilemma is in a sense an admission that there's an equality between the two individuals, at which point I say, then we treat them both equally. We say both are valuable, both are unrepeatable and irreplaceable, and it would be wrong to directly and intentionally kill either. So whatever I do to try to intervene in a situation that is threatening both people's lives, if it's post-viability, you could put the baby in an incubator and do what's needed to save the mom's life. But if it's pre-viability, you realize if the mom dies, who else dies? The baby dies. So we're like, okay, well then let's look for an ethical way to address the underlying pathology or whatever the medical condition is and respond to that without directly and intentionally ending the life of the child, because it's her child.
I know you've spent a lot of time, and we've discussed even all the different potential, like even recorded medical cases,
right,
that have to do with pre-viability, life-threatening complications for the mom. And because there is this very popular narrative today that you need abortion,
right,
because of the life-threatening things that could be posed to the mother's health, and abortion is medically necessary, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And then obviously there's ectopic pregnancy, which I want to hear your take on that too.
Okay.
But give us your 60-second Stephanie Gray Connor's response to, you did some of it just now, but response to, okay, sure, it all sounds good what you're saying, but there are cases where there needs to be an early delivery at minimum of that unborn baby before viability because of life-threatening complications to the mother. And in that case, like let's say she has ruptured membranes or she has some other thing, she's bleeding out, and they need to deliver baby. And in that case, sometimes you might even have to use tools to expedite the delivery, which could cause bodily harm to the baby. But either way, that baby's going to die because the baby's pre-viability. How is that not an abortion? Again, this is I would argue this is if they had to pick one on the pro-choice side to try to get the public's imagination to think, well, I guess we need abortion. And again, these are less than 1% of cases, or even less than that. I mean, that includes all like extreme cases that have to could justify for abortion. The vast majority of abortions that are legal today have nothing to do with what we're describing. This is super niche, but these cases are what's used to justify legalizing abortion on demand. What say you?
So what I would say is the principle always holds that we may never directly and intentionally kill one innocent person in order to save another. And I believe that we can find, if we start going into specific cases, ways that show reverence for both lives without doing an evil to bring about the good of saving one life. Then I really would have to unpack it. So it's hard to go into 60 seconds.
And what's so compelling about what you're saying too is that there are countless cases where they say, oh, she's going to die if she doesn't have an abortion. And they're wrong.
Well, and so let me give you an example.
Wrong.
You mentioned the premature, PPROM, it's like premature rupture of membranes. I know a pro-life doctor who had that exact case. A woman was brought to his hospital, and I don't know the exact date, but it was pre-viability, and I believe it was around week 19. So she still had a couple weeks to go to get to viability, and she had the premature rupture of membranes. And almost every doctor would say, induce labor, we need to bring this baby out. And this doctor said, I want to do expectant management. I'm going to explain to you what that is and what that can look like. We're going to keep you in the hospital. We're going to manage all your vitals. We're going to look for the presence of infection. If there isn't a presence of infection, this is what we're going to do. And we're going to watch. Is it possible? Because when people are like, well, let's just induce, let's just bring the baby out. Is there a pathology? Is there a presence of a pathology? I'm not saying this isn't a risky situation, but is it possible that we wait and watch and then we respond to the specific crisis? Is there an infection that needs responding to, that needs to be expelled from her body? Not expelling the baby like chorioamnionitis. We're not trying to get the baby out of her body. We're trying to get the chorioamnionitis, the infected membranes, out of her body. And of course, the baby's going to come along with that. But is that present yet? And are we able to address this? So in this case, this doctor with expectant management
saved both their lives.
Saved both lives. And that little girl is now 12 years old today. And that patient, the mother, said to that doctor, use my story, tell that story. And literally almost every other doctor would have said, are you crazy? Of course, he gave her full knowledge and information about what he was suggesting. But how often is the other side doing that? Like, watch closely. Monitor carefully. I'm not talking about just go home and do your thing and let us know if you start to feel sick. Of course not. Like, take very good care of both patients. But yes, there are other times where you can intervene because you're responding specifically to the presence of a pathology. There is a difference between not being able to save someone's life. In the case of a pre-viable baby, you don't have another environment for the baby to go to because incubators will work maybe 21 weeks or so. I mean, that's changing a bit, but certainly no baby has survived in an incubator at 15 weeks, okay? So there may be times where we can't save the baby, but that's very different from directly killing the baby or doing something to the woman that is not yet justified because the pathology actually isn't yet present, or whatever the case may be.
I want to come back to that and make that distinction further, because I think we're getting into this principle of double effect here.
That's an important principle that comes into play.
Which we can get to, and I think this happens more often than we realize, because the weight of a doctor's opinion, especially in a moment of emergency, is everything. I mean, you're a patient, you're thinking, oh my gosh, I have to listen to this person. And our medical system is so pro-abortion.
Right.
Most doctors are not trained to see them both as patients.
Yes.
I mean, I tell the story often of my sister-in-law brother have a baby. He was missing because of amniotic bands likely. He's missing part of his hand, and in utero, the doctor saw that at 20 weeks, and immediately they're recommending termination. I mean, it's insanity.
Insane.
But
totally
that is
insane.
such a common experience that termination is the go-to recommendation. And so of doctors today.
Right. So what is so important in these situations is if I can trust the doctors and I can trust the system, that their default is reverence for life, and it's reverence for all life. I'm not talking about having an attitude of not caring about the pregnant woman. I want the doctors to care very much for me. But I need to trust that they value my child as much as they value me.
They told this couple that you can get pregnant again.
Right. And again, so
baby's
it's this replacement
expendable
mentality. Even, for example, let's take the example of a tubal ectopic pregnancy. Ectopic simply means out of the uterus, and typically that's in the fallopian tube because that's where fertilization occurs. And what happens with the tubal is the baby never goes from the tube to the uterus like it should. It stays in the tube and then begins to implant in the tube instead of the uterus. The tube wasn't designed for implantation, it was designed for transportation. So now this baby is burrowing, typically because there's tubal structure or function problems. So the little hairs weren't working properly to sweep the baby down, or there was a structural problem where the baby couldn't get down in time so that when they were ready to implant, they were in that environment. So in that case, you have a life-threatening situation. And this is where you could say at this point, the fallopian tube itself has become pathological. With the implanted baby there, the tube is now eventually going to burst, and in bursting can bring about the death of the mother and the death of the baby. So what can we do? Well, first of all, we can do expectant management. We look to see how is this occurring, and we monitor very closely to see, is it a wait and watch? Do we actually have to intervene because it's about to burst? If the baby is alive, you can do what's called a salpingectomy. It's a well-known and respected procedure, a medical intervention, and that is a procedure where this whole section of the fallopian tube is removed. And then if we could transplant the baby, we would. We can't. The baby's, first trimester very early, typically maybe 6 weeks or something. So the baby will die.
Do you get that? Do you hear the abdominal cavity type ectopic response? And also there was actually an incredible case of this mother of I think 6 or 7 other children who baby
or multiples.
Singles. They were she had several other children. She
in her womb.
No.
Oh, sorry.
Born children.
Kids. Okay.
She's pregnant again.
Got it.
The baby implants in the C-section scar.
Oh yeah.
And the doctors all said 99% chance you're going to die. Abort. It's not even abortion then to remove this baby. And she said, no, I'm Orthodox Christian. And she survived.
And she did. And the baby managed to grow. Wow.
The baby grew. Wow. Everybody was fine.
Never heard of a case like that. That's amazing.
It's extremely rare.
In my book, My Body for You, I share a story that touched me so deeply. I interviewed the father of a friend of mine, and my friend's mom, when she was pregnant with his sister, my friend was around 2 years old. When he was pregnant with his sister, she was told she had very severe cancer, aggressive cancer, I should say. And she was, I think, around 16 weeks pregnant. And the doctor said, you must have an abortion and then we'll begin treatment.
And the justification there is too much strain on the body, right? Well as the treatment could cause harm to the child, and that would just kill the child anyways.
I don't even went to that nuance, but it's like, this cancer's so bad, we need to just get rid of get rid of the cancer.
Get rid of baby. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so they, the woman immediately said, no, I'm not going to do that. And so instead of waiting till viability and then maybe doing an early induction where the baby could go in an incubator and they could do the cancer treatment, she said, I want to give my baby the best possible chance. I will carry this pregnancy until it naturally comes to birth, which went to 40 weeks. And as soon as the baby was out, let's begin treatment. And she lived for 2 years, but she ultimately succumbed to the cancer. The interview with her husband is profound because first of all, I think this woman is a saint. I think we could be praying to her for her intercession.
What's her name?
Lorraine. Lorraine was her name. And the husband, when he speaks of his wife, so here he is, right? Some people would say, I can't lose my wife because it's not just about the child in her womb. It's about my little 2-year-old boy. It's about me as a father. It's how can I raise this child? But the whole family, the daughter whose life was saved by her mom's sacrificial love, the son who was 2 years old, the now, widowed father of a widowed husband, all look at her as reminding them that their goal is heaven, and that she taught them through her life and her death what they are meant to live out, which is to take up your cross and follow me, which is to remember that love is our ultimate calling, and love meant Jesus laying down his life so that we might live. And Lorraine laid down her life so that her daughter might live. And now that they're this amazing family, the son is involved in Catholic ministry. Both children are married with children, and they just love and honor their mom's legacy. Was there sorrow and loss not having your mother raise you? Yes, but again, their goal is heaven, our focus is heaven. And when you live with a right ordered perspective, then you say, I won't do wrong to bring about a good. I just won't.
So beautiful. Those stories, and there's others like hers. I mean, there's obviously St. Gianna Beretta Molla and Chiara Corballis.
Yes,
and others
yes.
who are just it's so contrary to the modern sensibility today, which is like, of course, get rid of the baby.
Right.
Of course, you know,
Right.
but this other view is more human.
Yes.
It's more human. It's more oriented to love, which is how we're designed.
To love. And it brings us back to what I always try to get people back to when thinking about the abortion debate is, what is the nature of the relationship? Who are we talking about? It is a mother to child. It is a parent to child. What do we expect of parents? You know, when there's a burning building and a kid's inside, we envision always the parent's going to run in and rescue their child. They're not going to watch the child burn.
Okay, last thing we're gonna do, 60 seconds. You're so good at this one. I've learned a lot from you on this one, and I often use some of even the phrases that you use, but rape and incest. Why is abortion always wrong, including in cases of rape and incest?
Right.
And let's do the hardest core case. Let's do an 11-year-old girl,
Right.
victim of incest, brutal. She's now carrying, a child is now carrying another child.
Right. We have to, I think, always begin by acknowledging the terrible, terrible, evil, crime, brutal ugliness that this topic is and what has been done to such precious girls. In acknowledging that, we need to ask an important question. If she's already pregnant, the child has to come out of her body eventually, one way or another. So what is most ethical? Bringing the child out dead or alive? Because someone who's pregnant won't be pregnant forever. And so since the child is alive, then the most ethical thing would be birth, even if a vaginal delivery would not work. If the child is so young that perhaps her hips aren't wide enough to get the baby out, a cesarean section delivery at birth is ethical, whereas directly killing one child is going to not only end that child's life, but I would argue cause untold harm to the mother of the child. Another question we can ask, is it fair to give the death penalty to the innocent child? Something we don't even give to the rapist. Unless my understanding is where the death penalty is allowed, you don't get death penalty for rape. If it's rape and murder, then you'll get the death penalty possibly for the murder part. But the point is, we're not even giving that consequence to the guilty, terrible father of the child that we're now talking about giving to the child. Another question to ask is, will it unrape the rape victim? And I have talked to various rape victims who have acknowledged the trauma of the rape itself is what caused all kinds of problems for them. And when they didn't get pregnant, they still were traumatized. If they had gotten pregnant and had an abortion, it wouldn't have taken that trauma away. And I'll often tell the story that you have beautifully told through live action of Liana Rebelito, you know, raped at 12 and pregnant. And she, you know, heroically and beautifully carried her child to term and raised her daughter, who became her best friend. So it is possible. And in fact, and then another woman I know was raped, but she opted to have an abortion. And she has said in interviews that it was harder to deal with the abortion than the rape because she said, I chose the abortion.
We just did another face-to-face, and we had a beautiful soul there who was a rape survivor as a teenager, had an abortion because they all told her. Everyone ganged up and said, of course, let's get the abortion.
Right.
And to this day, it's not the rape that brings her the greatest grief, it's the abortion.
Yeah, yeah. So we need to acknowledge the trauma that has gone on, but then we need to get back to what's the most ethical response to the trauma. And creating more trauma and creating more victims is not going to help the situation. Life and life-affirming answers are always what is going to lead to human flourishing.
Stephanie Gray Connors, you are the best. This has been awesome. It's so good, and you've got such a gift that has helped so many people. And I just want to honor you and say how grateful I am for you. Tell people where they can find your work.
Yes, so loveunleasheslife.com. It's got my blog, my books. My books are where I've really unpacked things, as well as links to all kinds of interviews and debates I've had over the years, including my debate against Peter Singer and various abortionists.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.